another one of our online lectures here in History Through Film. Today we're going to hit up our second learning outcome for our unit on Eastern civilizations. The first outcome was about China, and we spent very little time on China. I called it our appetizer, but it was essential because it helps set up the Japanese. The Japanese borrow very heavily from their neighbors to the west, China. So when we look at the Japanese in this unit, we're actually going to break it down into three pieces. We're going to look at the Japanese samurai, then we're going to look at Japanese imperialism, and we will finish by looking at post-World War II Japan. So we're going to cover a wide gamut of Japanese history in this section. Today we're going to focus just on the samurai. The samurai are one of the most interesting cultures to come out of really anywhere because of their fighting skills and their loyalty and honor, and just such a unique group of people that sadly don't exist anymore due to Japan modernizing in the late 1800s. So that's part of our story here today. We've got one learning target that we're going to seek to answer here. The question says, generalize who the samurai were and what they meant to Japanese culture. By the time we're done with this, and by the time we've seen the film The Last Samurai, we'll have a pretty good working knowledge that we can use to answer this question. So we need to start with Japanese feudalism. Feudalism is an interesting thing. You see the word feud in there, and people automatically think there's a lot of fighting going on. And sometimes there was, but that's not exactly how feudalism works. So early Japan was organized into a strict hierarchy called feudalism, and we'll see a pyramid of this on the next slide. Basically, feudalism is a political system which included several key players. You had the emperor, the shogun, who was the supreme general of the emperor's army. You had landowners called daimyos, warriors called samurai, farmers and peasants, and merchants. And they all worked together. It was really a give-and-take relationship. The daimyos owned the land, but they needed the land to be protected, so they gave some land to the samurai. The samurai in turn protected the land. The farmers and peasants were given land to work. In turn, they were the ones producing the food and materials needed for everybody to survive. So feudalism really is a complex organization that involves all of these players. As mentioned earlier, the Japanese borrowed much of their culture from China and Korea. That's why I thought it would be very important for us to talk about China at the beginning of this unit. Now, we could have spent weeks talking about Chinese history. I mean, Chinese history is 4,000 years old. Instead, we just did a brief little snapshot of ancient China, because you will see some similarities between their culture and the Japanese culture, and that's intentional. The Japanese borrowed very heavily from their neighbors. So the early Japanese people didn't have a real organized religion. You wouldn't have had Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, or Judaism in this region of the world. Instead, they had something called Shinto. Shinto was really not organized around like a creator god. It had more of an emphasis on spirits in nature and your ancestors. And that was later combined a little bit with Buddhism. So Buddhism does later spread to Japan. And when we watch the film The Last Samurai, you're going to see a little bit of that represented in that film. So here's the pyramid I was talking about. At the top you have your emperor, and sometimes the emperor was a figurehead, which means the emperor didn't have a lot of power. Other people behind the scenes, such as the shogun, could manipulate the emperor and take power. And you're going to see some of this in the film as well. Then we've got our daimyos here that own the land, the samurai who followed Bushido, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, which was their code of honor, or their warrior code, all the way down to your peasants, your artisans, and your merchants. So this is how Japanese society was set up under feudal Japan. So the samurai were members of Japan's warrior class. They were protectors. They were not an army. They weren't used to go invade other territories. They weren't used to attack and ambush people. They were protectors. And that's very important to know, because when we look at their code, which is called Bushido, it tells us a lot about who they were. So they followed a strict behavior code known as Bushido, also known as the Way of the Warrior. And, some of the words that really stand out are honor and integrity and compassion, duty, loyalty. These are the things that the samurai stood for. And for sure, when we watch the film The Last Samurai, those words are going to really ring true, I believe. So they were not warriors bent on attacking and being offensive. They were more defensive, there to protect the people and be honorable. So samurai acted as royal bodyguards to lords and daimyo. Daimyos, again, are those landowners. And certainly they would protect the people living on the lord's land or the daimyo's land. So in a way, they were really protecting everybody. And you had people who wanted to take land from each other. You had daimyos that wanted to start wars with other daimyos, and the samurai were there to protect. Sometimes those samurai were used a little bit differently, but for the most part they were used as protectors or royal bodyguards. So samurai were expected to show reckless courage, discipline, reverence to the gods, and fairness or generosity towards those who were weaker. And this, I think, says a lot about who they are, too. This is definitely something that embodies Bushido, that warrior code I was just talking about. Samurai carried a long sword called a katana and a short sword called a wakizashi. And they really became like the samurai's weapons, obviously, but it was so iconic of the samurai to have these two swords. Here's some examples of what they looked like, some different colored ones. Of course, the katana was your main offensive weapon, or defensive, depending on how you are fighting, I guess. And the wakizashi, in a lot of ways, was a little bit more symbolic. Especially when we talk about seppuku here in a little bit, which is a ritualistic suicide, the wakizashi might come in and be used. So I'll talk about that in just a little bit. One of the things that was very iconic in seeing a samurai oftentimes was the hairstyle. So their hair would be pulled back in essentially a little bun on the back of the head called a top knot. And so that top knot was a sign of respect. You're talking about a time period where regular haircuts would not have been a thing, so you would have tied your hair up into this top knot, and that was very iconic of the samurai. So the death of the samurai. Well, dying an honorable death was more important than living a long life. Now, this is not to suggest that all the samurai wanted to rush into battle and get killed, but they were trained that fighting honorably for the people they're meant to protect was their job. And if that meant dying, trying to protect those people, that was far more honorable than growing old and retiring and, sitting on the porch drinking tea in your 70s or 80s. So realistically, death on the battlefield was something that samurai were trained to look forward to. Obviously, self-preservation mattered, but death in battle was honorable. But here's the deal. If you were dishonored, let's say you were tasked to protect a lord or a group of people, and you failed to do so, you would be dishonored. And so some samurai were known to take that short sword, that wakizashi, rip open their belly, and kill themselves in a ritualistic suicide called seppuku. This was done to regain your honor. It's a very unique practice. We really don't see this anywhere else in any other culture. So it's definitely something that becomes well associated with the samurai. It's not pleasant, but we will see this in the film The Last Samurai. Now, the samurai don't exist anymore, and I think that's a shame, especially when you see what they stand for. So let's talk a little bit about what happened to them. So the decline of the samurai really comes with the Tokugawa shogunate, who ruled Japan from the early 1600s to the mid-1800s. This was essentially a line of shoguns that really wanted some different things from Japan. So the Tokugawa shogunate were a dynasty of shoguns that ruled a unified Japan from 1603 to 1867. So after the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, change comes. And I think it had started with the Tokugawa shogunate, but after this group of rulers, you have a new emperor, and the new emperor's name is Emperor Meiji. And Emperor Meiji wanted to modernize Japan to compete with the Western world. This time period is known as the Meiji Restoration. Well, you look at this starts after 1867, so it's almost immediately after the end of the American Civil War. That will matter because when you see the film The Last Samurai, you're going to see that connection. So this meant when they started modernizing Japan, this meant that the daimyos were drained of their power and their land, and the military was reformed to resemble the British style. So they got rid of feudalism. The daimyos didn't have their land out in the countryside anymore. The emperor would now control Japan. Along with that, the samurai weren't necessary anymore because they were importing new weapons, rifles, cannons, howitzers, artillery, things like that the British and the Americans had been using for quite some time now. And so they were starting to reform their military to look more like that, the British or Western style. Well, obviously you can think that a bunch of samurai with swords are going to be less effective in that type of warfare. So an idle samurai class during peacetime was seen as incompatible with the new modern Japan. Like, you have these samurai out there who are meant to protect, but who are they protecting now if the daimyos don't have their land? And how can they protect if they still have bows and arrows and swords when you're going up against rifles and artillery? So samurai became unemployed, and the government tried to abolish the entire samurai class. You're going to see them called savages. You're going to see them called rebels in the film The Last Samurai. And that's not who they are. They're not uprising. They're not trying to take over Japan or anything. They're essentially being pushed out, and it's propaganda to make the people see them as enemies, which is really sad because for hundreds and hundreds of years, the only thing the samurai were known for is being honorable protectors, and now that's changing to fit Japan's new Western model. Samurai were banned from carrying swords in public and had their bureaucratic status removed. You'll see a little bit of this in the film. And ultimately, the samurai way of life was pushed out and slowly faded away. It just didn't work. And I think the advancement in technology, specifically in warfare, was going to do a lot of this anyway, but who's to say the samurai didn't start using rifles instead of swords? But they never really were given that chance. And so the samurai really just, by the end of the 1800s, were no longer useful and pretty much disappeared from Japan. And this is what we're going to see in the film The Last Samurai. Last Samurai will take place, like I said, right after the American Civil War in the 1860s, 1870s. This is a film that came out in 2003 starring Tom Cruise and Ken Watanabe, who was nominated for an Oscar for his role as Katsumoto in this film. Definitely a well-known actor. You've maybe seen him in Inception and Godzilla and Batman Begins and several others as well. This film was directed by Ed Zwick and really does a nice job showing us how Japan is modernizing, and we're seeing the end of the samurai. So that's going to be our background into this film. So we're just going to revisit our learning target one last time. The learning target said, generalize who the samurai were and what they meant to Japanese culture. And I think with the information that we just took down in this lecture, we have everything we need there. However, we will see more of this in the film The Last Samurai to give us a better perspective of who the samurai were and ultimately what happened to them. So that's going to do it for us here. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.